Owen had developed a very important survival philosophy during his 3 years in the imperial palace of Varelia. The less anyone remembered his face, the longer he would remain alive. This was not pessimism. It was simply an observation based on patterns. In the palace, people who were remembered too clearly tended to disappear shortly afterward, often escorted by polite soldiers carrying energy rifles and expressions of deep professional regret. Therefore, Owen lived quietly. He wrote quietly. He even breathed quietly. The palace itself was anything but quiet. It was a vast structure of silver arches and transparent corridors floating above the violet atmosphere of Virelia Prime. Ships glided past the upper windows like silent predators while distant orbital cannons rotated lazily in the sky. Every hallway hummed with technology older than most civilizations. Yet within all that grandeur, Owen had successfully maintained the life of a ghost, which was exactly how he preferred it. He was a scribe, which meant his job was to write down what powerful people said and pretend it all made sense. The Varelian Empire loved records, treaties, battle reports, council arguments, ceremonial speeches that lasted long enough for stars to evolve. Everything had to be documented. Unfortunately, powerful people also said many very stupid things. Owen had learned quickly that writing those things exactly as spoken could be dangerous. So he developed a useful habit. He wrote the official version for the archives and the honest version somewhere else. That somewhere else was a small black notebook hidden beneath the sleeping mat in his tiny room. It was not a political document. It was not a secret report. It was simply Owen surviving the palace with humor. Inside its pages, he recorded things like, Admiral Terran spoke for 23 minutes today and said absolutely nothing. This may be a new galactic record. Or, the Minister of Trade believes lowering tariffs will confuse the economy. I believe the minister should not be allowed near numbers. Most of the notes were harmless observations about court life, strange alien customs, or the deeply mysterious fact that no one in the palace seemed capable of laughing. The Varelians looked very similar to humans. Same height, same general form, but their long, elegant ears curved slightly upward and gave them an almost mythical appearance. Combined with their calm expressions and glowing pale skin, they looked like people who had never once slipped on a wet floor or walked into a doorframe. Owen suspected this was inaccurate. He simply hadn't caught them yet. Still, the most fascinating person in the entire palace was the one Owen worked hardest not to look at. Queen Kestra, the Empress of the Varelian Empire, conqueror of 3 systems, commander of fleets large enough to block out stars, and unfortunately for Owen's personal dignity, a woman with a very confident walk. The first time he had seen her cross the council chamber, the entire room had fallen silent. Not because she demanded it, the silence simply happened. Her presence carried the quiet gravity of a black hole. Tall, composed, with long crimson hair falling behind her shoulders, and those unmistakable Varelian ears rising elegantly above it. She moved like someone who knew every eye in the room was watching, which of course they were. Owen had tried very hard not to notice. He failed immediately. Later that evening, while sitting alone in his small room with the notebook open on his knees, he wrote one short observation. Queen Kestra walks like someone fully aware that she is terrifying, respected, and possibly admired, but also extremely aware of how dramatic that walk looks from behind. He stared at the sentence afterward for a long time. Then he sighed. Congratulations, Owen, he muttered quietly. You are going to die someday because of a notebook. Still, he kept writing. The notebook became his private map of palace life. He recorded everything. The way commanders argued about battle tactics, like children fighting over toys. The strange Varelian tradition of bowing exactly 7 degrees when greeting royalty. And the impressive number of people who pretended they understood hyperspace economics. And occasionally, he wrote about the Queen. Not disrespectfully, just honestly. The problem with honesty, Owen would soon discover, was that honesty had a terrible habit of being discovered. Unfortunately for him, the Imperial Palace was currently preparing for its quarterly security sweep. This was a routine procedure meant to detect spies, smuggling devices, illegal communication systems, and any other unfortunate surprises that might threaten the empire. It was also conducted by soldiers who searched absolutely everything: rooms, storage units, personal belongings, sleeping mats, which meant that at this exact moment, somewhere in the palace corridors, a group of highly efficient royal guards was slowly moving closer to Owen's room, closer to his bed, closer to the small black notebook hidden beneath it. Owen, meanwhile, sat peacefully at his desk in the archive hall, carefully copying a treaty about asteroid, mining rights, and thinking about lunch. It was, in retrospect, a very calm moment before a very large problem. Owen was halfway through copying the seventh paragraph of a mining treaty when the first sign of trouble appeared. It came in the form of silence. Not the normal palace silence filled with distant engines and whispering corridors. This was the very specific silence that happened when armored soldiers suddenly entered a room and everyone tried very hard not to look suspicious. Owen kept writing. Professional scribes developed excellent instincts for danger, and one of those instincts was simple: never be the first person to look up. Boots stopped behind him. Heavy boots. The kind of boots that did not belong to librarians. "Continue writing," a calm voice said. Owen did not need to look up to know that voice belonged to a Varelian security officer. The tone had that smooth, unhurried confidence that came from carrying a plasma rifle large enough to politely rearrange planets. He continued writing. The sentence he was copying read, "All mineral extraction within the asteroid belt of Sector 9 must be approved by Imperial oversight." The officer spoke again. "Routine security inspection. Your quarters will be searched." Owen nodded without turning. Of course. He even managed to sound calm, which would have been impressive if his brain had not simultaneously begun screaming. The notebook. His mind immediately began calculating probabilities. Perhaps the guards would not search under the sleeping mat. Perhaps they would search quickly and leave. Perhaps the universe would suddenly collapse into a convenient black hole. All three possibilities seemed equally likely. "Your name," the officer said. "Owen Halver," he replied, still writing. "Occupation: imperial scribe. Species: human." There was a pause. "Interesting." Owen did not know what that meant and decided not to ask. The officer's boots moved away across the archive floor. Several other soldiers followed, their armor softly humming with power. A moment later, the quiet murmur of the archive room slowly returned. But Owen's hand had stopped moving. The sentence in front of him now read, "Must be approved by Imperial oversight and..." The rest of the line remained empty. His brain had abandoned all mining treaties and was now focused entirely on the location of one small black notebook. Across the palace, several floors above the archive hall, 3 Varelian guards entered Owen's room. The room itself was painfully unimpressive. A narrow desk, a chair that looked mildly offended to exist, a sleeping mat on the floor. One of the guards scanned the walls with a handheld sensor. "Human living quarters," the first guard said. The second guard looked around. "Minimalist." The third guard crouched beside the sleeping mat. "Or messy." He lifted the mat. Something slid out. A small black notebook. The guard picked it up. "Reading material?" The first guard shrugged. "Check it." The third guard opened the notebook. The first page contained a simple sentence. "Private notes. Owen Halver." The guard flipped the page. He read silently. Then he stopped. Then he read the line again. Slowly, his long Varelian ears tilted upward. "Is something wrong?" the second guard asked. The guard holding the notebook turned another page. Then another. His expression became complicated. "Technically," he said slowly, "this may qualify as a security concern." "Why?" The guard held the notebook up. "Because the human has written observations." "Observations about what?" There was a pause. The guard cleared his throat. "About the Queen." The other 2 guards immediately leaned closer. "What kind of observations?" The guard read a sentence quietly. The room became very still. The second guard blinked. "He wrote that?" "Yes." The first guard leaned over his shoulder. "What does the next line say?" The guard hesitated. Then he read it. The silence that followed was so thick it could probably be measured by scientific instruments. Finally, the first guard said, very carefully, "We cannot ignore this." The second guard nodded. "Yes." The third guard closed the notebook. Protocol states that any document involving the Queen must be delivered directly to her. Another long pause. The second guard looked at the notebook. Do we have to read more of it? The first guard shook his head. No. The third guard sighed. That is probably wise. Meanwhile, several floors below them, Owen sat in the archive hall staring at the unfinished sentence on his screen. His instincts were now screaming loudly enough to be considered a public announcement. Something had gone wrong. Very wrong. He could feel it. A few minutes later, the heavy boots returned. Owen did not turn. He simply waited. The officer stopped beside his desk again. Human Owen Halver. Owen slowly looked up. Yes? You will come with us. Owen blinked. For what reason? The officer studied him for a moment. Then he held up a familiar black object, the notebook. Owen stared at it. Every possible future he had imagined suddenly merged into one extremely embarrassing outcome. Ah, Owen said quietly. The officer gestured toward the corridor. The Queen wishes to speak with you. Owen stood slowly. His mind produced one final helpful thought. You should have burned the notebook. Then another thought followed immediately, or at least stopped writing about the Queen's walk. The guards escorted him out of the archive hall. Behind them, the unfinished mining treaty remained glowing on Owen's screen. Must be approved by imperial oversight and... The sentence still had no ending. Owen suspected the rest of his day might be equally unfinished. The walk to the throne chamber felt longer than any journey Owen had ever taken, including the 12-day cargo flight he once endured beside a malfunctioning refrigeration unit that screamed every time the ship turned. That flight had at least offered snacks. This one offered 3 heavily armored guards in a future that seemed increasingly short. The corridors of the Imperial Palace stretched endlessly, curved walls of silver metal reflecting soft violet light from the planet below. Outside the massive transparent windows, ships drifted in orbit like silent giants, their hulls glowing with the faint shimmer of shield generators. Owen had always liked the view during his quiet walks to the archive hall. Today he noticed absolutely none of it. Instead, he focused entirely on the notebook held in the hands of the guard walking ahead of him. His notebook. The small black rectangle that had seemed so harmless when hidden beneath his mat now looked like a portable execution order. Owen cleared his throat cautiously. Hypothetically, he began. The guard did not turn around. Yes. Hypothetically speaking, if someone had written something slightly embarrassing in a private notebook... Silence. And that notebook was accidentally discovered during a security sweep. More silence. Would that person be immediately executed, or is there some sort of official embarrassment procedure first? The guard walking beside him glanced down. Embarrassment procedure? Yes, Owen said quickly. Perhaps a warning, a lecture, a mandatory class about respectful royal commentary. The guard considered this. I am unfamiliar with such a class. That's unfortunate, Owen muttered. They continued walking. The palace corridors slowly grew larger and brighter as they approached the central chamber. The architecture changed as well. The plain metallic walls gave way to towering columns carved from luminous crystal. Energy currents moved through the transparent structures like slow lightning, feeding power into the systems of the palace. Owen had always suspected that the Varelian Empire built its buildings the same way it built its fleets. Large, impressive, and slightly intimidating for no practical reason. At the end of the corridor stood a pair of enormous doors, the throne chamber. 2 royal guards stood beside the entrance, their armor darker than the others, etched with the crest of the empire. Their long ears curved elegantly behind their helmets, giving them the appearance of statues carved for war. One of them spoke quietly into a wrist communicator. The human has arrived. The doors opened. The throne chamber was massive. Owen had seen it before during official council sessions, but standing at the entrance alone made it feel even larger. The ceiling arched high above like the inside of a starship hull. Floating lights drifted slowly in the air, illuminating rows of alien nobles and officers who had clearly been summoned for something unusual. At the center of the chamber stood the imperial throne, and seated upon it was Queen Kestra. Even from a distance, she was impossible to ignore. tall, composed, and absolutely certain of her place in the universe. Her crimson hair fell behind her shoulders like a banner of fire, and her long Varelian ears curved gracefully upward. She wore dark royal armor rather than ceremonial robes, its polished plates reflecting the pale light of the chamber. She looked less like a ruler and more like someone who had personally conquered gravity. In one hand, she held a small black notebook. Owen felt his soul briefly attempt to leave his body. The guards escorted him forward across the long floor of polished crystal. Every step echoed faintly, which Owen considered extremely rude of the floor. The court watched. Nobles whispered quietly to one another. A few generals looked amused. Most looked curious. None of them looked sympathetic. Owen stopped several meters from the throne. The guard stepped back. The room fell silent. Queen Kestra looked down at the notebook in her hand. Then she looked at Owen. Her eyes were bright gold, sharp and calm. "You are the human scribe," she said. Owen nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty." Her voice was smooth and controlled, the kind of voice that could probably order entire fleets to turn around without raising its volume. "You keep records." "Yes." She lifted the notebook slightly. "Very personal records." Owen considered lying. He considered fainting. He considered sprinting toward the nearest window and attempting orbital escape without a ship. Instead, he said very quietly, "Sometimes." The Queen opened the notebook. Owen immediately stared at the floor. She turned a page, then another. Her expression did not change. "Your handwriting is surprisingly organized," she said. "Thank you," Owen replied automatically, before realizing that was probably not the correct response. A faint murmur moved through the court. The Queen flipped another page. Then she read aloud. "The Queen walks like someone fully aware that half the room is watching." Owen closed his eyes. Yes, that was definitely his sentence. Several officers in the chamber shifted awkwardly. One of the generals coughed. Queen Kestra turned another page. "And here you wrote, 'The palace floor seems designed to amplify dramatic entrances.'" Another pause. More whispers spread through the court. Owen slowly opened one eye. The Queen's face remained perfectly calm, which somehow made the situation worse. She turned one more page. This time she stopped. Her eyes moved across the sentence. For the first time, something changed. Her eyebrow lifted slightly. The room grew even quieter. Then Queen Kestra looked up at Owen. "You wrote," she said slowly, "'The Queen commands fleets with terrifying confidence and walks with the unmistakable certainty of someone who knows exactly how impressive she looks from behind.'" Owen felt the universe collapse inward. He waited for the guards to arrest him. He waited for the Queen to order his removal. He waited for literally anything that involved less humiliation. Instead, something very unexpected happened. Queen Kestra leaned back slightly in the throne and laughed, not politely, not quietly. She laughed openly, the sound echoing through the enormous chamber. The court froze in absolute shock. Several nobles looked like they had just witnessed a solar eclipse. The Queen wiped a tear from the corner of her eye and looked down at the notebook again. "Well," she said, still smiling, "that is certainly a new description." The laughter did something very strange to the throne room. It broke it. For several seconds, the enormous chamber, normally a place of absolute discipline and quiet authority, looked like a group of statues that had suddenly been informed gravity was optional. Nobles stared at one another, officers blinked, and one particularly elderly minister seemed so confused that he began adjusting his robe repeatedly as if clothing might restore order to the universe. Owen remained exactly where he stood, mostly because his legs had forgotten how to operate. Queen Kestra was still smiling as she looked down at the notebook in her hand. The laughter faded into a quieter amusement, though her golden eyes still carried a bright spark of curiosity. "You expected to die," she said calmly. Owen nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty." That was a reasonable expectation. Several members of the court nodded instinctively, which Owen felt was extremely unhelpful. The Queen closed the notebook slowly. "Yet here you are." Owen considered several responses. None of them seemed safe. Finally, he said the first honest thing that came to mind. "I'm also surprised." A faint ripple of quiet laughter moved through the chamber. The Queen tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You wrote these observations without fear?" Owen hesitated. With a lot of fear, actually. Another ripple passed through the court. Kestra leaned forward slightly on the throne, resting one armored elbow against its armrest. Explain something to me, human. Yes, your majesty. You live inside the palace of a ruler known throughout the galaxy for her temper. Yes. You record your thoughts privately. Yes. And among those thoughts you chose to document my posture. Owen cleared his throat. It is very noticeable. Several nobles made choking sounds that were not quite coughs. The queen's long ears twitched slightly. You also wrote that my stride is dramatic. Owen nodded cautiously. It is. And that the entire council chamber watches when I walk. Owen hesitated. Well, they do. A few heads in the room turned quickly away from the throne. Queen Kestra noticed. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Do they? Silence fell again. The queen leaned back slowly, her gaze drifting across the assembled court. Admirals, diplomats, ministers, every one of them suddenly seemed fascinated by the architecture of the ceiling. Kestra looked back at Owen. Interesting. She lifted the notebook again and flipped through several pages. You write about many things. The council, debates, military strategy, trade negotiations. Yes, and you do not sound very impressed. Owen chose his next words carefully. I try to write honestly. The queen studied him. Honesty is unusual here. That was my observation. She turned another page and read quietly for a moment. Then her mouth curved again with amusement. You wrote that Admiral Terran once spoke for 20 minutes without completing a single sentence. A loud cough erupted somewhere behind Owen. The queen glanced briefly toward the sound. Admiral Terran stared at the floor with heroic determination. Owen sighed softly. Yes, that happened. Kestra closed the notebook again. You realize this document could insult nearly everyone in this room? That was never the intention. What was the intention? Owen paused. The answer was embarrassingly simple. Survival. The queen's brow lifted slightly. Explain. Owen took a careful breath. When humans live in places that are overwhelming, we write things down. We make jokes. We describe what we see, even the awkward parts. It helps us stay calm. A quiet murmur moved through the chamber. Kestra's expression softened with interest rather than anger. You find my empire overwhelming. Yes. And your solution was humor. Yes. The queen turned the notebook over slowly in her hand. For years, my court has treated me like a weapon. No one spoke. Generals obey. Diplomats bow. Admirals tremble when I enter a room. Her golden eyes returned to Owen. But you wrote about how I walk. Owen shrugged carefully. You walk very confidently. A noblewoman somewhere in the chamber made a strangled sound that might have been a laugh quickly disguised as choking. The queen's smile widened slightly. You see a conqueror. Yes. And yet you write about ordinary things. Owen nodded. I see a person. The words hung in the air. For a moment, the enormous chamber seemed to pause with them. Kestra looked down at the notebook again, turning it slowly between her fingers. You may be the first person in this palace, she said thoughtfully, who wrote about me without fear or worship. Owen considered correcting her. Then he remembered the phrase reasonable expectation of death and decided silence was safer. The queen rose from the throne. The movement alone made half the court straighten instantly. She descended the steps slowly, her armored boots echoing across the crystal floor. Owen stood very still. She stopped directly in front of him. Up close, the presence of the Virelian queen was even more overwhelming. Her golden eyes studied him with calm intensity. She held out the notebook. Owen blinked. I'm not being arrested? Kestra raised one eyebrow. Should you be? Owen thought about several specific pages. Possibly. That earned another soft laugh from the queen. She placed the notebook into his hands. Keep writing, human. Owen stared at the notebook as if it might explode. You're serious? Yes. He looked up cautiously. And about the parts involving your dramatic walking? The queen's expression remained composed, but her eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. Those, she said, were surprisingly accurate. The throne chamber slowly returned to the strange rhythm of imperial life, but the air inside it had undeniably changed. It was subtle. No alarms had sounded, no official announcement had been made. Yet everyone present understood that something unusual had just happened. A human had embarrassed himself in front of the most feared monarch in the galaxy, and survived. Owen was still trying to understand how that had occurred. He stood exactly where the Queen had left him, holding the small black notebook with both hands as if it were an unstable alien artifact that might explode if tilted incorrectly. The court watched him. This made the situation much worse. A tall Varelian diplomat leaned toward another noble and whispered something. The noble covered his mouth, clearly fighting the dangerous urge to laugh. Across the chamber, a group of officers looked at Owen with expressions usually reserved for experimental technology that had accidentally become self-aware. Queen Kestra, meanwhile, had returned to the throne, but was not behaving like a ruler who had just finished judging a criminal. She looked entertained. Owen decided that standing silently forever was probably not a viable long-term plan. He cleared his throat. "Your Majesty?" Kestra looked at him. "Yes, human." He lifted the notebook slightly. "So, I may continue writing in this?" "Yes." "Without execution?" "Yes." "Without imprisonment?" "Yes." "Without mysterious disappearance during the night?" The Queen tilted her head. "That one depends on the quality of your observations." A ripple of laughter spread across the chamber. Owen nodded slowly. "That seems fair." The Queen rested one arm against the side of the throne, studying him with obvious curiosity. "You record what you see," she said. "Yes." "You record honestly." "I try to." She gestured slightly toward the gathered nobles. "Then tell me something, human scribe." Owen suddenly had a very bad feeling. "What do you see now?" The entire court turned toward him. Owen considered pretending to faint. Instead, he said the safest possible thing. "I see a room full of extremely powerful individuals who are all pretending they were not listening very carefully a moment ago." Silence fell. Then several nobles began coughing again. Queen Kestra's smile widened. "Accurate." Encouraged by the fact that he was still alive, Owen added cautiously, "I also see a lot of people who were very curious about that notebook." More coughing. One elderly minister dropped a small data tablet. Kestra leaned forward slightly. "And what do you see when you look at me?" The room froze again. Owen's brain immediately began screaming warnings. This question had the potential to end his career, his life, and possibly his species' diplomatic reputation. He chose honesty. "I see someone who frightens nearly everyone in this room." The Queen did not react. And someone who finds it funny." A faint murmur moved through the court. Kestra rested her chin lightly against one gloved hand. "You think I enjoy this?" Owen shrugged carefully. "A little." The Queen's golden eyes gleamed with quiet amusement. "You are unusually direct. Humans are not very good at elegant lies." "That is becoming clear." She leaned back against the throne again. "For many years, my court has been very careful with their words." Owen glanced at the silent nobles. "Yes, I noticed." A young Varelian officer near the back of the room suddenly became extremely interested in studying the floor. Kestra continued, "They fear saying the wrong thing. That seems wise. And yet you wrote an entire notebook of wrong things." Owen opened the notebook and flipped a few pages. "In my defense, some of them are accurate wrong things." That earned another quiet wave of laughter. The Queen stood again. The court straightened instantly. She stepped down from the throne with calm, measured steps and began walking slowly across the chamber floor. Owen watched her approach and immediately understood something unfortunate. The notebook had been correct. The walk was very noticeable, not exaggerated, not dramatic for show, just confident in a way that naturally pulled attention toward it. She moved like someone who had spent years commanding starfleets and expected gravity itself to cooperate. Owen made the mistake of glancing briefly behind her as she passed one of the crystal pillars. His brain immediately produced the worst possible thought. "You should write this down." He closed his eyes. "Please do not write that down," he whispered to himself. The Queen stopped beside him. "You said something." Owen opened his eyes quickly. "Nothing important." Kestra looked at him with calm suspicion. You were thinking. That happens sometimes. What were you thinking? Owen hesitated. The entire court leaned slightly forward. That the notebook was correct. The silence that followed was so complete, it almost felt like space. Then the Queen laughed again. Not loudly this time. Just a soft, amused sound. She turned back toward the court. Apparently, she said calmly, our human observer has excellent attention to detail. Owen quietly closed the notebook. He had a feeling the next entries were going to become even more dangerous. The court session ended in a way that confused nearly everyone present. Normally, imperial meetings finished with precise orders, strategic decisions, or fleet deployments. Today, the most memorable event had been a human explaining why he wrote about the Queen's walking posture. History would probably struggle to categorize the moment. As the nobles slowly began leaving the throne chamber, quiet conversations filled the enormous hall. Some voices sounded amused, others bewildered, and a few carried the careful tone of people attempting to decide whether they had just witnessed a clever political maneuver or a complete breakdown of imperial protocol. Owen stood near the center of the chamber, holding his notebook like a fragile diplomatic treaty. He was still alive. This remained deeply surprising. Queen Kestra had not left. She remained near the base of the throne steps, speaking quietly with one of her admirals while the chamber gradually emptied. The admiral nodded several times, bowed, and departed with the cautious expression of someone who had just received instructions involving either a starship fleet or a dangerous experiment. Owen considered leaving. Unfortunately, the nearest exit required walking directly past the Queen. He studied the floor carefully. Maybe if he moved slowly enough, he could escape unnoticed. He took one step. Owen! He stopped immediately. Queen Kestra had not raised her voice, yet somehow the single word crossed the chamber with perfect clarity. He turned. Yes, Your Majesty. She gestured slightly toward a nearby balcony overlooking the planet below. Walk with me. Owen's brain produced a variety of responses. Most of them involved hiding behind furniture. Instead, he nodded and followed. The balcony doors opened automatically as they approached. Cool air flowed in from outside, carrying the faint electric scent of Virelia Prime's atmosphere. The city below stretched endlessly across the planet's surface, glowing with millions of lights and floating transport lanes. Owen had seen the view before. It still made him feel like a small insect observing a machine the size of a continent. Queen Kestra rested her hands lightly against the balcony rail. Beautiful, she said. Yes. For a moment they simply watched the city. Starships moved slowly through the upper atmosphere, their engines leaving pale trails across the dark sky. Far above, orbital defense platforms glimmered like artificial stars. The silence was not uncomfortable, which confused Owen slightly. You are not what I expected, the Queen said. Owen blinked. I'm fairly sure I'm exactly what you expected. No. She glanced at him. I expected fear. Owen shrugged. There was a lot of fear. You hid it well. I tried. Kestra turned her gaze back toward the city. Most people here speak carefully around me. Yes. They praise everything I say. Yes. They pretend my decisions are flawless. Owen hesitated. Yes. The Queen's lips curved slightly. You do none of these things. I tried to. You failed. That is accurate. A transport ship roared quietly overhead as it passed through the upper atmosphere. Kestra watched it for a moment before speaking again. When you wrote those notes, you were not thinking about politics. No. You were not thinking about power. No. You were simply writing what you observed. Yes. She studied him again. That is unusual. Owen leaned against the balcony rail. Humans are unusual. That is becoming clear. He flipped the notebook open thoughtfully. You know, this is the first time anyone in the palace has asked why I write things down. What is the answer? Owen tapped the page lightly with his finger. It helps me understand people. Kestra tilted her head. You believe writing reveals truth. Sometimes. And what truth did you discover about me? Owen considered the question. The safe answer would have been something respectful. Unfortunately, honesty had already become a habit. I discovered that everyone here is terrified of you. The Queen did not argue. And? And I discovered you probably know that. Kestra looked back toward the glowing city. Yes, Owen continued. But I also discovered something else. She waited. You're bored. For the first time since stepping onto the balcony, the Queen looked genuinely surprised. Bored? Yes. Owen gestured toward the massive palace behind them. Everyone here behaves perfectly. They say the correct things. They bow at the correct angles. No one says anything unexpected. He tapped the notebook again. But humans say unexpected things constantly. Kestra's long ears lifted slightly with amusement. I have noticed. Owen flipped to one of the earlier pages. You know why I wrote about your walk? Because you lack self-preservation. That too. He smiled slightly. But also because it was the first interesting thing that happened in that council meeting. For a moment, the Queen simply stared at him. Then she laughed quietly again. The sound drifted out across the balcony and disappeared into the night air. You may be the most dangerous person in this palace, she said. Owen frowned. I'm a scribe. Yes. She gestured toward the notebook. And yet with that small object you make emperors and admirals uncomfortable. Owen looked down at it. I hadn't considered that. Kestra stepped away from the balcony rail. Keep writing. Owen blinked. You're encouraging this? Yes. Even the embarrassing parts. Especially those. She turned toward the chamber doors. The lights of the palace reflected softly off the polished armor across her shoulders. Because, she added calmly, it may be the only honest record this empire has. Several weeks passed before the palace stopped whispering about the notebook. In truth, the whispers never completely disappeared. They simply evolved into a new and slightly more cautious form of curiosity. Whenever Owen entered a room, conversations paused for a moment, as if everyone present suddenly remembered something mildly embarrassing. He had become famous. This was extremely inconvenient for a man whose entire survival strategy depended on being forgettable. At first, Owen tried to return to his old routine. He worked quietly in the archive hall, copied military reports, and cataloged starship deployments like nothing unusual had happened. Unfortunately, the palace had already decided otherwise. The first change appeared during a council meeting. Owen sat in his usual position near the wall, recording the discussion about hyperspace trade routes. Admiral Terran was speaking again, which meant the conversation had been going in circles for nearly 20 minutes. Owen wrote carefully on his datapad. Admiral Terran has once again discovered a new method of explaining nothing using very impressive vocabulary. A shadow appeared beside him. He looked up. Queen Kestra stood there. Entire fleets had surrendered faster than Owen's heartbeat at that moment. She glanced down at the datapad. What are you writing? Owen considered lying. Then he remembered that lying had never worked particularly well around her. Observations. About the meeting? Yes. Let me see. The room slowly grew quiet as people realized the Queen had stopped beside the human scribe. Owen handed over the datapad. Kestra read the line. Her shoulders shook once. Then she handed it back. Accurate. Admiral Terran continued speaking, completely unaware that the ruler of the empire had just confirmed a sarcastic comment about him. The meeting continued, but something had changed. The Queen occasionally glanced toward Owen, not with anger, with curiosity. By the end of the week, it had become routine. Owen attended council sessions as usual, recording official discussions while quietly filling his notebook with the human version of events. The difference now was that the Queen sometimes asked what he had written, not during the meeting, afterward. Once, while leaving the strategy hall, she simply held out her hand. The notebook. Owen hesitated. Some parts are not diplomatic. Neither is war, she replied. He handed it over. She read 3 pages while walking slowly across the corridor. Then she returned it. You described Minister Lareth as a man who argues with gravity when objects fall. Owen sighed. That was a stressful meeting. Kestra smiled faintly. He does argue with gravity. Another day she stopped beside him during a fleet briefing. What did you write about my entrance today? Owen froze. You want the honest answer? Yes. He opened the notebook reluctantly. I wrote that the entire room straightened like someone suddenly increased the planet's gravity. The Queen considered that. Then she nodded. That is also accurate. The strangest change, however, happened to the court itself. At first, the nobles had treated Owen like a dangerous curiosity, someone whose private thoughts might accidentally escape onto paper. Then something unexpected began happening. People started laughing, quietly at first. During long meetings, someone would glance toward Owen and smile, already imagining what ridiculous sentence might appear in the notebook later. A few officers even began making small jokes of their own, testing the strange new atmosphere that had appeared in the palace. The tension inside the court slowly softened. Not dramatically, but noticeably. One evening, Owen returned to his small room and opened the notebook. He flipped through the pages. The early entries were cautious observations written by a nervous outsider trying to survive inside an alien empire. The later pages were different, still sarcastic, still honest, but no longer written by someone who felt invisible. Owen picked up his pen. He began writing. 3 weeks after the incident of the notebook, the imperial palace remains standing. The Queen continues ruling the most powerful empire in the sector. Admirals still give speeches that defy logic. Ministers still argue about hyperspace tariffs. The primary difference is that people occasionally laugh now. He paused, then added another line. Also, the Queen is fully aware that everyone watches when she walks. This knowledge appears to amuse her. A quiet knock sounded on his door. Owen looked up. "Come in." The door opened. Queen Kestra stepped inside. She looked around the small room with interest, as if examining a new and unfamiliar type of starship. "You live here," she said. "Yes. It is very small. I do not command fleets." She noticed the open notebook. "Writing again?" "Always." Kestra stepped closer. "May I?" Owen handed it to her. She read the newest entry silently. When she reached the last sentence, a quiet laugh escaped her. "You are consistent," she said. "I try." She returned the notebook. Then she spoke in the same calm voice she used when commanding entire armadas. "History will remember my wars." Owen nodded. "Probably. It will remember the systems I conquered." "Very likely." She gestured lightly toward the notebook. "But this—" Owen looked down at it. "This is different." "Yes." He smiled slightly. "It's the human version." Kestra turned toward the door. As she left, she added one final sentence without looking back. "Make sure you record everything, Owen." He blinked. "Everything?" "Yes." She paused at the doorway. "Especially the embarrassing parts." The door closed. Owen sat quietly for a moment. Then he opened the notebook again and began writing.